The air was thick with humidity, the kind that made shirts cling to backs and turned a simple walk into a sweaty ordeal. James Holloway wiped his brow as he tightened his grip on the worn-out steering wheel of his aging sedan. His daughter, Sophie, sat in the back seat, her little legs swinging as she hummed along to the faint sound of the radio. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice small but curious. "Are we still having spaghetti tonight?" James forced a smile, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Of course, sweetheart," he said, though his stomach twisted at the thought. He had exactly $112 in his wallet, enough for a box of pasta and a can of sauce, but not much else. He sighed, his mind racing through the never-ending list of bills waiting at home. Rent was overdue, the electricity bill sat unopened on the kitchen table, and his phone had been shut off 2 days ago. He had picked up every extra shift he could at the auto repair shop, but the money never seemed to stretch far enough. As he turned onto the quiet road leading to the grocery store, he spotted something up ahead. A car sat at an awkward angle on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking. An elderly woman stood beside it, looking helplessly at her flat tire. James sighed. He didn't have time for this. But as he slowed down, he saw the way she clutched her purse to her chest, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly as she looked around, unsure of what to do next. "Daddy, is she okay?" Sophie asked from the back seat, peering out the window. James pulled the car to a stop a few feet ahead and ran a tired hand through his short brown hair. He should keep driving. He had enough on his plate. But then he looked at Sophie's wide, innocent eyes watching him, waiting for his answer. "She's probably just stuck," he murmured more to himself than to her. Sophie tilted her head. "We should help." James exhaled slowly before nodding. "Yeah, we should." He put the car in park and stepped out, walking toward the woman. "Ma'am," he called gently. She turned toward him, relief washing over her face. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, her voice warm but frail. "I didn't know what to do. My phone is dead, and I haven't changed a tire in years." James glanced at the car, a sleek black luxury sedan, expensive, the kind of car he would never be able to afford. "You got a spare in the trunk?" She nodded quickly. Yes, just, I don't know how to put it on anymore." She shook her head, chuckling softly. "I used to be able to do things like this, but I guess time has caught up with me." James gave her a small smile. "Don't worry, I got it." She beamed at him. "Oh, bless your heart, young man. Thank you." James walked back to his car and opened the passenger door. "Sophie, sweetheart, stay put, okay? I'm just going to help this lady real quick." His daughter nodded, watching him with curiosity as he grabbed his toolbox from the trunk. The woman introduced herself as Ellie Whitmore. She told him how she had been on her way home from the grocery store when she heard the unmistakable thump of a flat tire. James crouched beside the car, loosening the lug nuts with practiced ease as he worked. Ellie stood nearby, watching him with quiet appreciation. "You're good at this," she observed. James chuckled dryly. "I work at an auto shop. Been fixing cars since I was a teenager." "That explains it," she said with a smile. "Your daughter must be proud of you." James glanced back at Sophie, who had pressed her nose against the window, watching him intently. "I hope so," he murmured. Ellie was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "It's not easy, is it? Raising a child?" James stiffened slightly, but didn't look up. "No," he admitted. "It's not." She nodded as if she understood. "You're doing a good thing. Not just here, but in life. I can see it." James tightened the last lug nut and wiped his hands on his jeans. "There, you should be good to go now." Ellie clapped her hands together, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, you are a lifesaver. Thank you so much." James waved off her gratitude. "It's nothing, really." But Ellie wasn't done. She reached into her purse and pulled out something, pressing it into his hand before he could protest. "Please," she said, her voice firm but kind. "Just take it." James looked down at the envelope in his hand, confusion flickering through him. It felt thick. He started to open it, but she gently patted his arm. "Not here," she whispered with a knowing smile. James hesitated, then nodded. "All right." Ellie gave him one last thankful smile before getting into her car and driving off. James stood there for a long moment, staring at the envelope in his hands, his heart pounding. Sophie's voice broke the silence. "Daddy, what did the nice lady give you?" James swallowed hard and climbed back into the car. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said. As he drove toward the grocery store, his hands trembled slightly on the wheel, and for the first time in a long time, a small flicker of hope sparked in his chest. James parked in the grocery store lot, his hand still gripping the envelope Ellie had given him. His heart pounded as he ran his thumb along the flap. He had received tips before, small tokens of appreciation when he helped a stranded driver or went the extra mile at work. But this felt different. He exhaled sharply and glanced at Sophie, who was watching him with patient curiosity. He opened the envelope, and his breath caught. Inside was a thick stack of crisp bills. James's fingers trembled as he pulled them out, quickly counting. 1, 2, 3. $500. His throat tightened. $500. More than he made in a week of hard labor at the shop. More than enough to buy groceries, pay the overdue electricity bill, and fill up his gas tank. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Daddy, is it a lot?" James swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, it's a lot." He sat in stunned silence for a moment, the weight of the money pressing against his palm. Ellie hadn't hesitated, hadn't asked for anything in return. She had simply given, as if she had known exactly what he needed. A small voice inside him urged him to return it. It wasn't right to take that much from a stranger, even if she had offered. But another voice, the one that had been keeping him awake at night, running through unpaid bills and empty cabinets, told him that maybe, just maybe, this was the break he had been waiting for. He exhaled and slipped the money back into the envelope, tucking it into his jacket pocket. Right now, he needed to focus on Sophie. They stepped into the store, the blast of cool air a welcome relief from the heat outside. James grabbed a cart, and for the first time in months, he didn't have to calculate each item down to the penny. He let Sophie pick out her favorite cereal, added fresh produce instead of canned goods, and even grabbed a small carton of ice cream, something he hadn't been able to afford in months. As they reached the checkout, Sophie tugged on his sleeve, pointing at a display of colorful balloons. "Can we get one?" James hesitated. A balloon wasn't a necessity. But then he looked at her hopeful face, the way her fingers curled around the fabric of his shirt. He grabbed a pink one shaped like a heart. "Just one," he said with a smile. Sophie beamed. That night, as she fell asleep with the balloon tied to the bedpost, James sat at the small kitchen table, the unopened electricity bill in front of him. He held the envelope Ellie had given him, running his fingers over the crisp edges of the bills. He could pay the bill. He could fill his gas tank. He could buy Sophie the things she needed without worrying if they'd have enough left for rent. But something about Ellie's generosity didn't sit right with him. Not because he didn't need the money. He did desperately. But because he hadn't done anything to deserve that much. A simple tire change shouldn't have earned him $500. A thought nagged at the back of his mind. Who was Ellie Whitmore? She had been kind, warm, but there had been something else in her eyes, a depth that suggested she wasn't just another stranded driver. James pulled out his phone, remembering too late that it had been shut off. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. He needed answers. The next morning, he drove down the same road where he had helped Ellie, hoping that maybe he'd spot her again. But the road was empty, save for the occasional passing car. Later that afternoon, after his shift at the auto shop, he stopped by the gas station and asked the clerk if they knew anything about Ellie. The older man behind the counter scratched his chin. "Ellie Whitmore lives up in that big house on Willow Lane." James's brows furrowed. Willow Lane was the wealthiest part of town, a neighborhood he had never stepped foot in. "She's a real sweetheart," the clerk continued. "Been in this town a long time. Used to run a charity or something. Her husband was some big-time investor before he passed." James nodded slowly. A wealthy widow. That explained the luxury car. but it didn't explain why she had given him $500 for changing a tire. That evening, as he put Sophie to bed, he found himself staring at the little pink balloon bobbing gently against the ceiling. Ellie had helped him without hesitation. Maybe it was time. Time he did something in return. The next day, he made his way to Willow Lane. The houses were massive, each one more extravagant than the last. He found Ellie's home easily, a grand, sprawling estate with a perfectly manicured lawn. He hesitated at the gate, suddenly feeling out of place. His worn-out jeans and grease-stained hands didn't belong here. But then he thought of Sophie, of the relief he had felt when he opened that envelope. He rang the doorbell, and a few moments later, Ellie opened the door. She looked surprised but pleased. "James, what a nice surprise." James cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of what to say. I wanted to thank you for what you did." She smiled warmly. "You already did, dear, by helping me." James shifted on his feet. "It was too much. I can't take that kind of money for a simple tire change." Ellie chuckled. "Come inside." He followed her into the house, marveling at the high ceilings and elegant decor. She led him to a cozy sitting room, where she gestured for him to take a seat. "I know it seemed like a lot," she said, settling into a chair across from him, "but I didn't give it to you just for changing a tire." James frowned. "Then why?" She studied him for a moment before speaking. "Because I see someone who's trying his best. Someone who reminds me of the man my husband used to be." James blinked. "Your husband?" Ellie nodded. "He grew up with nothing, built everything from scratch. And along the way, people helped him. He never forgot that." James exhaled slowly. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep it," she said gently, "and that when the time comes, you help someone else who needs it." James thought of Sophie, of the bill still waiting at home, of the way Ellie had spoken about her husband, about giving without expecting anything in return. He nodded. "All right, I'll keep it." Ellie smiled. "Good." As James left the estate, he felt lighter somehow. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. James left Ellie's house with a strange mix of gratitude and unease swirling inside him. He had accepted her gift, but a part of him still felt unsettled. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of generosity. His entire life had been a struggle, working for every dollar, scraping by, never expecting anything to come easily. And yet Ellie had given without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. He pulled into his driveway, cutting the engine and sitting in silence for a moment. Sophie was inside, probably playing with her toys or drawing at the kitchen table. He thought about how different her life could be if things weren't always so tight. How different it could be for both of them if he had just a little more stability. The next day at work, James kept his head down, focusing on the cars in front of him. He had already decided that the money Ellie gave him would go toward catching up on bills. But it didn't change the fact that he needed a better solution, a long-term one. He couldn't keep relying on luck or the kindness of strangers. By midday, his boss, Carl, called him into the office. James wiped his hands on a rag and stepped inside, expecting to be assigned another job. But Carl's expression was unreadable. "You got a minute?" Carl asked, leaning back in his chair. James nodded, taking a cautious seat. Carl tapped his fingers on the desk. "Had an interesting conversation this morning." James tensed. "About what?" Carl smirked. "About you." James stiffened. He hadn't done anything wrong, at least not that he knew of. But the way Carl was looking at him made his stomach twist with uncertainty. "Ellie Whitmore came by," Carl continued, watching James closely. James blinked. "She came here." Carl nodded. "Wanted to know about you. Said you helped her the other day, and that she had a feeling you were someone worth knowing." James shifted in his seat. "I just changed your tire." Carl chuckled. "Well, apparently that tire change made an impression. She asked me about your work, your experience, how long you've been here." James frowned. "Why?" Carl leaned forward. "Because she's got a friend who owns a high-end repair shop in the city. They only take specialty cars, imports, classics, restorations. Pays a hell of a lot better than what you make here. James's heart pounded. What are you saying? Carl smirked. I'm saying she put in a word for you. Her friend wants to meet you. If it works out, you could be looking at a job that pays 3 times what you make now. James sat there stunned. A week ago, he was barely keeping his head above water. Now he was being offered an opportunity he never even considered possible. Carl's expression softened. Look, I don't want to lose you. You're one of my best guys. But I know you got a kid to take care of, and this kind of opportunity doesn't come often. James swallowed hard. This is real. Carl nodded. Very real. You'd be working with top-tier mechanics, getting hands-on with cars you'd never see in a place like this. James exhaled sharply. He had spent years fixing everyday cars, old sedans, worn-out trucks, rusted engines that barely held together. The idea of working on high-end vehicles, making real money, was almost too much to process. But then doubt crept in. What if I'm not good enough? Carl scoffed. James, you've been doing this for years. You got the skill. You just never had the opportunity. James ran a hand through his hair. This was it. A real chance to change things for himself and Sophie. Carl slid a business card across the desk. Call him. Set up the meeting. James hesitated for only a second before taking the card. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, James sat at the kitchen table, staring at the card. His mind raced with possibilities. He could finally give Sophie the life she deserved. He wouldn't have to worry about overdue bills or stretching every paycheck to the limit. But there was fear too. Fear of stepping into something unknown. Fear of failing. The next morning, he called the number on the card. A deep, confident voice answered. James Holloway. Yes, sir. I heard good things about you. Think you can meet me tomorrow? James hesitated for only a heartbeat before saying, yes. And just like that, everything was about to change. James arrived 15 minutes early to the meeting, his palms slightly damp despite the cool morning air. The repair shop was unlike anything he had ever seen before. A sleek, pristine building with a glass front showcasing luxury cars lined up inside. These weren't the old, rusted vehicles he had spent years fixing. These were top-tier imports, classic restorations, and high-performance machines worth more than his entire house. The moment he stepped inside, the hum of activity was different from what he was used to. The mechanics moved with precision, their uniforms spotless, their tools neatly arranged. A man in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward, extending a firm hand. You must be James Holloway. James shook his hand, nodding. Yes, sir. Name's Richard Calloway. Ellie speaks highly of you. James tensed slightly at the mention of Ellie. He still didn't fully understand why she had gone out of her way to help him. Maybe she saw something in him that he couldn't see in himself. Richard gestured toward a sleek black Porsche that sat lifted on a hydraulic platform. Come on, show me what you can do. James followed him to the car, his nerves settling as he grabbed a set of tools. The moment he touched the engine, instinct took over. He examined the intricate mechanics with a practiced eye, quickly diagnosing a minor fuel injection issue. He loosened a few components, adjusted the line, and within minutes, had the engine purring smoothly. Richard watched with a critical gaze, nodding approvingly. Not bad at all. James straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. I've been doing this a long time. Richard studied him for a moment before speaking. I can tell. You know your way around an engine. And more importantly, you don't waste time second-guessing yourself. James exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment. He had spent years fixing cars just to survive, never once considering that his skills could lead to something more than a paycheck barely covering the bills. Richard folded his arms. Ellie told me you've got a daughter. James hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Sophie. She's 7. Richard's expression softened slightly. You ever worked on high-end vehicles like these before? James shook his head. No, sir, but I learned fast. Richard smirked. That's what I like to hear. He walked over to a nearby workstation, picked up a clipboard, and scribbled something down. Then he turned back to James. "How soon can you start?" James blinked, his breath catching in his throat. "You're offering me the job." Richard nodded. "You've got the skills and you've got the drive. I need mechanics who don't just do the work, but take pride in it. Pays good, full benefits, and if you stick around, there's room to move up." James felt his chest tighten. This was it, the break he had been waiting for. A real chance to build something for himself and Sophie. He swallowed hard before answering. "Can start right away." Richard extended his hand again. "Then welcome aboard." James shook his hand, the reality of the moment sinking in. As he left the shop, his mind raced with everything this meant. He could finally move out of the small, run-down house that barely kept the rain out. He could pay off his debt, save for Sophie's future, and give her the stability she deserved. And none of it would have happened if he hadn't stopped to help Ellie that day. That evening, as he tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Daddy, you look happy." James smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I am, sweetheart." She yawned. "Is it because of the nice lady?" James thought of Ellie, about her kindness, about the way she had changed his life with a simple act of generosity. "Yeah," he murmured. "It is." As he turned off the light and closed her door, he made a silent promise to himself. One day, when he was in the position to do so, he would pay it forward, just like Ellie had done for him. James sat in his worn-out kitchen chair, fingers drumming lightly against the table as he stared at the contract from Richard's shop. It was real, a steady job with a salary large enough to not only cover his expenses, but build a life for Sophie. It felt surreal, like he was standing at the edge of something far bigger than he had ever dared to dream. The phone rang, and he hesitated before picking it up, still getting used to having service again after paying the bill. On the other end was Ellie's warm voice. She asked him how the meeting with Richard had gone. When he told her about the job offer, she simply said, "I knew he'd see what I saw in you." James leaned back, exhaling slowly. He still didn't understand why she had gone out of her way for him. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know how to thank you for all this." She chuckled softly. "You already did, James." That day on the road, before he could respond, she continued, her voice carrying a thoughtful weight. "I'd like you to come by my house tomorrow. There's something I'd like to give you." James hesitated. He had already accepted more than he ever thought he deserved, but there was something about her tone that made him agree. The next afternoon, he drove to Ellie's house, feeling oddly nervous. As he stepped up to her grand front door, she greeted him warmly, inviting him inside. As he followed her into the sitting room, she gestured for him to take a seat, but instead of settling into her chair, she walked over to a small wooden chest resting on a side table. Opening it, she carefully pulled out a thick envelope and turned to face him. "I want you to have this," she said, handing it to him. James frowned, looking down at it. He could already tell it wasn't just a few bills like last time. He hesitated before opening it, and when he did, his breath caught. Inside were stacks of crisp $100 bills. He flipped through them, his hands shaking slightly, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This is too much," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie smiled gently. "It's exactly the right amount." "It is. $115,000. James swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "Why?" She sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "Because kindness should never go unrewarded. That day, you stopped when you didn't have to. You helped me without expecting anything in return, and that tells me the kind of man you are." James shook his head in disbelief. "But this is life-changing money, Ellie." She nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "Many years ago, I was in your position." James frowned, caught off guard. "You—" Ellie smiled faintly. "Yes, when my husband and I were just starting out. We had nothing. There was a time when we couldn't afford groceries, when we weren't sure how we'd keep the lights on. Then one day, A stranger helped us just because they could. They gave us a gift that changed everything, and we swore that when we had the chance, we'd do the same for someone else. She gestured toward the envelope in his trembling hands. This isn't charity, James. It's a promise being kept. And now, it's your turn to do the same when the time comes. James exhaled sharply, the weight of her words sinking in. I don't know what to say. Ellie reached over, placing a gentle hand on his. Then don't say anything. Just promise me one thing. James looked up, meeting her kind eyes. When the time comes and you're in a position to help someone the way I helped you, pay it forward. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As he left Ellie's house, the envelope still clutched in his hands, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And for the first time in years, the future didn't seem so uncertain. It seemed full of possibility.